Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 8th Berwick Literary Festival on this Sunday morning. I'm Chloe Smith and I'm part of the festival team, and I'm really delighted to be hosting this morning session with Gemma Milne. Just a few housekeeping things before we begin. Your cameras and your microphones are off and they will remain off throughout the session. But after Gemma and I have spoken, we're going to have a Q&A, and at the bottom of your screen is a Q&A function. And at any point during the talk, you can put a question in there, and then I'll come to those when we get to the Q&A. So yeah, please do put your questions in. So I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Gemma. Gemma's a science and technology writer and journalist. And we're going to be talking about her book, Smoke and Mirrors, How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It, which I have here. Gemma, it's really nice to speak to you on this Sunday morning.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. You know, it's actually a funny story about Berwick Literary Festival. In 2018, just after I got my book deal for Smoke and Mirrors, I went on a short holiday with my mum to Berwick, and it was literally like the week after we signed the papers, and the festival was on while we were there, and we were walking around being like, oh, one day you might get to speak at a literary festival when your book's out. And then so when they emailed me, I was like, oh my God, Berwick Literary Festival. So it's a special place in my heart, shall we say.
Oh, that's really nice. I like it when things like that happen.
Yeah, full circle.
Full circle. I wondered if we could begin, if you could talk a little bit about your background and how it was that you became a science and technology writer.
Sure. I mean, I've always been interested in science and tech. I was, that person at school who loved maths and science and was pretty nerdy. And I went and studied maths at university. And to be honest, I actually felt a bit let down by my degree, or maybe I just wasn't going to class enough to get the most out of it. But I ended up going, okay, I'm not going to go and have a career in science and tech. I'm going to try something else. I'm also kind of arty and I like music and stuff. So I thought, let's go do the creative thing instead of this maths and science thing. So, I Googled creative business jobs London and I ended up in advertising. And before that, I'd been in investment banking because of course that's where all the math students get pulled to. It wasn't long until I realized that, no, that wasn't for me. And I was missing sort of science and tech stuff. But working in advertising, particularly the job I ended up in was working with startups and kind of looking at new technologies that were, interesting for that industry. Kind of got me thinking about, the way the world works, how things intersect. I think working in an industry like advertising and also investment banking, you start to see some of these, like, I don't want to say hidden structures because it sounds very conspiratorial, but you start seeing how money moves and how things happen and the sort of deliberateness of some things and how some things kind of make you feel a bit iffy, but then other things you're kind of questioning yourself. And, working in the two arguably quite evil industries of investment banking and advertising, you're questioning your morals quite a lot, I suppose. And after a while working in that company and doing a lot of work with startups and whatnot, I got made redundant. And it was basically just a case of going, do I want to go back into science and tech, or do I want to build on what I've been learning through this sort of corporate work through my thoughts and feelings and the stuff that I've got to say, I think, about this world. Literally Googled how to become a freelance journalist and followed Google's advice. And of course, over the years, just done many different things within that: speaking, podcasting, writing, done a bit of like working with companies using the, I guess, experience I had at Ogilvy before. But it kind of always came back to my question around narratives and what we say about science and tech, and being frustrated seeing things, I guess, in the news and going, that's not really what's going on. Also being frustrated by people not thinking that science and tech was really interesting, because that's how I felt about it. Kind of trying to work through my own sort of idealism and love and whatever that I have for science and tech, but also my, I guess, skepticism and criticism that I have for a lot of the way things happen. So I guess that ultimately led me to writing about that. And I was very fortunate I got to have a rant in a book form, I guess.
Yeah, that's quite a journey that you've been on. And how did you go from, okay, I mean, I love that you Googled how to, I mean, God bless the internet.
Yeah.
I wonder how you got from that point of like, okay, writing, into then actually what I'm going to do is write a book.
I mean, it wasn't that when I Googled how to become a freelance writer, I also Googled how to eventually write a book. I mean, it wasn't sort of on the, although there did come a point that I Googled how do you end up writing a book, even after I got the deal, to be honest. But anyway, I think it was more a evolution of working out what I wanted to say. And I think probably quite a lot of writers have that, and not just writers, people who put their ideas out in the world, whatever format that is. You go on a sort of evolution of your ideas and you put things out and people respond to it. And then that kind of updates what you think. I mean, when I think about some of the things that I was writing when I first started freelancing and I read them now, I'm like, oh God, that's the sort of thing I would cite in a book about hype. That feels hypey, that feels contrary to how I feel, that feels technocratic, and I don't really feel like that anymore. So it was a journey, and I think the point of wanting to write the book was a sort of feeling the need to say more and have a bit more depth and have the permission say, yeah, we'll pay you a small amount of money to write a book on this, so therefore go off and research it and spend a load of time, as opposed to sort of, I wouldn't have written 100,000 words on this topic just randomly, even though I didn't, wanted to. I think I would have felt it didn't matter, and you're a freelancer, you always want to get paid for your words. But yeah, it was just a kind of journey, and also kind of feeling frustrated by what was out there, particularly in popular science writing and coverage in the business world of science and tech, particularly startups and whatnot, and just feeling like there wasn't enough nuance, or perhaps there wasn't enough space or column inches for the nuance, and that people in general, I would go to parties, or I would meet extended family, and I'd say, oh, I write about science and tech, and they'd be like, oh, is the robots going to come? Wanted to engage with the topics. I mean, most people just kind of go, all right, science tech, I don't know anything about that. But I felt like, it's a shame that people don't feel more empowered or able to, or, feel like they have permission to engage with what is seen as very complicated and not in their wheelhouse topics. So, it was kind of a combination of all of that led me to go in, right, I need to get this down somehow. And I was very fortunate that Little Brown let me do it.
I mean, yeah, we're fortunate that we get to read it.
Very
I
kind.
wonder that, I'm going to come back in a minute about give a very brief overview of the book, maybe for someone that hasn't read it. How would you describe it? Or if you're talking to someone about it in a short way, how do you talk about it?
Sure. Well, it's got 9 chapters, and they each focus on a different area of science and tech. So there's everything from quantum computing to cancer therapeutics to the food industry, all these sorts of things. And I wanted it to be, a text that you could read and have a level of understanding of what's going on in those spaces, but really you're getting enough information to have enough of an understanding of the system in which these things exist, politically, economically, socially, and scientifically and technologically, to engage. So instead of, getting the how does a quantum computer work and have a whole chapter just on how it works, it also looks at the industry behind it and what the dynamics are, and kind of talks about what is it that experts in this field are talking about at conferences, what are they debating, as opposed to what's the kind of 101 on science and tech. So it's not really popular science, it's a bit more than that. There's politics in there, there's economics, there's history, but it's hopefully a work that you can dive into, and then by the end of it feel like you have a broader understanding of those topics. But then if you see something in the news, you can go, aha, that reminds me of this, and oh, this is what my opinion is on it, and so on and so forth. So, and I hope, of course, in doing all that, see past these headlines and see past the hype that sells all these things in the first place.
That's funny. Do you know, I read, there was a headline the other day that was something about a cancer drug. I can't remember what it was now, but it came up and I thought, oh,
yes.
Pre-reading the book, I'd have been like, oh, great. And I completely have taken it at face value. And it was really interesting because then I was like, oh, hang on.
Yes. Yes, I'm so happy to hear that, because that was literally like what was driving the book. Because I mean, the title is, Smoke and Mirrors: How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It. And I think a lot of people think that it's a how-to guide around hype, which I think there are elements in there around how it is that you navigate, but I didn't want it to be like a checklist, like here are the things you can do to make sure you're not scunnered by a headline, but rather showed what it means to really dive into a topic at a low level, a deep level, whatever, but dive in and have a bit of a map, as opposed to going, don't believe that robots are going to steal jobs because that's rubbish, and let me tell you why. It's more about, well, how do you actually look into this headline, and what does the truth in this headline actually look like? What is it that people who are really knowledgeable of the space, why are they rolling their eyes at it? But also, why does this stuff still get published if it's not fully true? So I wanted to give more context around things so that people could feel like they could engage, as opposed to just being fearful of being caught out by the press, which I think a lot of people is how they feel about science tech. They either just believe it blindly, or they go, oh, I shouldn't believe anything and I'm not an expert, so I'll just not engage, which is what I argue in the book, the absolute opposite of what we need in science tech. We need far more engagement by those who are non-experts within the actual tech space.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not someone, I'm sort of always interested in the world, but I think, yeah, I'd always sort of thought science and tech is over there, and I work in the creative industries, and that's over here. And actually, I've said this to you already, Gemma, but I was reading a book when I was on holiday with my friends, and honestly, poor friends, kept interrupting them constantly for the whole holiday, because I'd read another bit of the book and I'd sort of say, oh, I've just learned this really interesting fact, and oh my gosh, everyone, did you know?
No, I was so happy to hear that when you said it, and it was the same as another friend who read the book, or a friend who read the book, and she was saying that I think she was reading it and her boyfriend was listening to the audiobook at the same time, which I thought was very cool. And then they would get into these big debates about the stuff in the book, and I was like, that is exactly the point, because it's not a book of facts. There are facts in there. It's not about listing, it's about debate and about the fact that there aren't answers to whether or not AI is good or bad. It depends on so many things, and it's about jumping in and having debates about it. And so when she said, oh yeah, we spent the whole evening the other evening talking about quantum computing, and I was like, that is brilliant. I'm very happy to hear that. So yeah,
I found the section on batteries particularly interesting, because it feels like in that section in particular, it really covers the sort of the web of impact. So it talks about human rights impact, and it talks about environmental impacts, and how essentially you are weighing up these two things that almost cannot be weighed up.
Yes, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. And I, it's funny, I actually wanted to start the book with that chapter because I felt it was the most reflective of the themes of the whole book, but my publisher was like, you can't start a book about batteries because everyone's going to turn off. And I'm like, but they're so interesting. And he's like, convince them, but on chapter 2 or 3, not in the first chapter. And I was like, all right, fine. But yeah, I guess for people listening who haven't read the book, the context is that a lot of time when battery technology is talked about, it's very much focused on like, what is the tech? So does the battery use this new material, or does it let your phone last a bit longer, or does it make an electric car drive further? And it's like very focused on the tech specs of the battery, and the sort of hype around batteries is like the search for the holy grail, the battery, the one battery to rule them all, that's being invented by some person or some company around the world. And when you actually look at how the world functions with batteries, you have to start thinking about, well, what does it mean in terms of cost? What does it mean in terms of how they're manufactured? Where do you get your materials from? And that's where the human rights stuff comes in. Geopolitically, what does it look like with batteries? Because there's a high concentration of battery power, excuse the pun, in China. And what does that mean for Chinese companies supplying German companies, and what does that mean for negotiation around politics and power more broadly? So when we start thinking about, well, what does it mean to get a good battery? And if the focus is on tech, you're not taking into account all these other things. And when you start looking at it, you realize there isn't one right way to do it. You might optimize for climate change, but have to make compromises in human rights. Do we feel okay about that? Do we want to, get a battery quicker, in order to save the planet from climate change. But, you know, at the same time, a whole load of children are being forced into labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and vice versa, are we wanting to, you know, be much kinder to humans, but then have to kind of sit back and go, well, it's going to be more reliance on fossil fuels, you know. So it's one of the areas, and that's the same as all science and tech and all complex systems. There's this balancing act that needs to happen. So and that's why we don't have solutions right now, because there's a lot of debate. But if people are not only reading about, oh, there's this new fancy battery that's been invented, of course you're going to think, well, cool, why is my iPhone dying after a day? And why don't we all have electric cars right now fueled by the best batteries? And why can't we have you know, solar panels that gather sun throughout the day and then it stores in a battery, and we don't have to worry about using fossil fuels? Like, these questions are difficult to answer if you don't think about this broader system and think about this kind of, frankly, moral conundrum that is what it comes down to at the end, at the end of it, around how we manage that balancing act. So yeah, just wanted to give that context for anyone, because that's I love that chapter, and I'm always like, don't be bored by batteries. Batteries are amazing.
Yeah, no, I found that one. I was at a friend's birthday last night, and I started talking to someone about batteries.
Yes, life and soul.
I know, but it's one of those things that, again, because I think especially there's lots of talk because of batteries around things like electric cars and renewable energy, and it's very easy to just say, great, that sounds really brilliant, that technology is here, why aren't we just using it? And actually, suddenly you sort of realize, oh, it's really not as simple as that.
Yeah, and it also, I think, makes you, for people who are in the industry, you know, maybe working as software developers or working as scientists or so on and so forth, I hope that what the book does for people like that, or this kind of writing, which there's more of now in the coverage of science tech world, which is brilliant, is making them realize that it's not enough to only know about the tech specs. It's not enough to only consider how best to engineer a battery. You have to think about politics, you have to think about social impacts, you have to think about geopolitical impacts and human rights, like in climate change and all these other things. Like, science and tech is not that separate thing that you mentioned earlier. It's not this little box over here that's not political and is just based on facts. It's socially constructed, it's impacted by so many different things: finance, politics, you name it, bias. And so if we want the world to be a better place, we cannot all sit in our own little boxes. We have to be able to wrestle with not only complex systems, but the difficult questions that arise when you start trying to fix these problems, the compromises that have to be made, the sort of swallowing of the fact that, oh, if I do this thing, it's going to have a negative impact over here, but can I justify it? Is that cost worth it? And so on and so forth. And then you get into questions of, like, you know, whose life is more important, which of course is a really difficult question to ask or answer. So it's not enough for us all to sort of sit back and say, oh, I sit in this box, or I don't know about this thing, or this headline told me this. Like, we have to engage and we have to wrestle with these difficult questions in order for things to be better.
So we've touched on batteries. So the book covers a really wide range of topics. You know, it sort of goes to food production, to AI, to aliens, to cancer drugs. I wonder, firstly, how you sort of decided on the range of topics, and secondly, I mean, there's a lot of research. Did it take a really long time to research all the topics?
Yeah. So in terms of the one, how I picked things, frankly, it was just what I was most interested in, and what I felt like there was something to be said about. I think the AI chapter is perhaps the one that there's already a lot of coverage in AI. And so I was really like, how do I say something different, or how do I add to this? Whereas the others, I felt like there isn't masses of, at least mainstream coverage around how you look at the whole system. There's a lot of coverage about specific things, like, you know, this new cancer drug or whatever, but there's not as much about, okay, how does regulation work, for instance? So for me, it was like things that I was interested in, but also there was a sort of missing argument to be made. I was also thinking about, what if I ask people who are in the tech and science industry, what would they say is super hypey? I think one chapter that I didn't do, that most people ask me, why didn't you do it, was run around blockchain and Bitcoin. And I deliberately didn't do that because I was like, it's going to be out of date before it even publishes, so there's no point. And also I'm still wrestling with how I feel about that industry, and I didn't feel ready to write about it at the time. So that was kind of how I chose it. And then in terms of the research, I mean, it was a combination of a lot of desk research. It was a lot of interviews. I interviewed about, I think it was 60 people in the end. A couple for each chapter, and then people more broadly around the sort of phenomenon of hype and how narratives work and impact things. And I don't know, there was also just a lot of like building on the years of, I guess, work that I'd had, where I'd been in, working with a whole load of startups in all different industries, and being like, what are the dominant narratives that I hear when I'm going to conferences? What is it that frustrates me about people's misunderstanding or misinterpretation of things? And also, like, what have I changed my mind about? Like, what did I think was super wowy and awesome, and now 3-4 years later, or however long, I have a more nuanced take? How do I share that with people? So it was looking at how does this work, and what do the politics look like, but really trying to hone in on those like aha moments that I was having. So I still needed to research how to do that, but I suppose a lot of it came from, I don't know, my emotions as well. So I didn't want it to just be this kind of book of facts, as I said before, because I didn't think it would do what I wanted it to do.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about those aha moments, were there any moments when you were researching or writing that you were surprised by what you were finding?
Yeah, I mean, there was stuff that my opinion changed on things as I was writing. When I pitched the book, when I was writing my proposal for nonfiction books, you write like a sample chapter or two when you're trying to get a book deal. And the sample chapter that I wrote was the quantum computing chapter. I thought, if I write what I think is the most complicated chapter, and the one that most people are going to be like, oh, I'm not reading about that, if that captures a publisher's attention, then anything will. So, and also I just happened to have been covering that specifically in my journalism at the time, so I kind of already had material I could draw on. So I wrote the chapter, and the focus of that chapter was about energy usage. It was about the increasing energy usage of computation, and the sort of, if we're really trying to get these all singing, all dancing machines, as the headlines would tell you, what's the impact on the environment? What does it mean, like using big data centers and all that sort of thing? So that was the argument I put forward. I had evidence for it. I had kind of interviews, but when I started fleshing that out a lot more to finish the book, I realized that actually my argument, A, wasn't really that strong enough, and B, some of it just wasn't right, at the end. That not right, not quite right is maybe the better way of putting it. And that kind of was interesting to me, because I was like, well, that's the point, right? When you start looking into things and you start thinking more about these systems, your assumptions about stuff, or a headline that you've read one time, you have to counter that with other things. It's not about not believing stuff, but it's about trying to get more context. So there was a lot of different stuff that happened as I was writing it, as I was researching things, that where I was like, oh, I feel uneasy about this, or I have a question about that, and I think I know what the answer is, and I'd go in and go, actually, no, that's not quite right. And I could have written a chapter about the environmental impacts of quantum computing, but just wouldn't have been as compelling, and it wouldn't have, it wasn't as bad as I thought, shall we say. And so it ended up being, as you'll know, a completely different argument that was more around basic science versus applied science and business. So there was many moments like that. And I part of what I wanted to do with the book too, for anyone reading it, was try and encourage, like, it's okay to change your mind, and it's okay to not know about something, and it's okay to constantly, the more information you get, the more, and how time changes, and the world changes, things change. It's not about having this like one view on something and then keeping bashing that drum. So if I wasn't doing that myself, then it wouldn't be a very successful piece, would it?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the sections. I mean, I just sort of thought, never did I imagine that I would be reading about like quantum computing. That was one of the sections where I was like, okay, dig in. I'm gonna learn something.
It was the most complicated one, to be fair, but it required, the thing is, my argument in that one is about the fact that it's difficult to explain and difficult to understand. That's part of the hype, right? Whereas with other things, it's not. With farming, it's difficult to understand how a tractor works. You know, it's that isn't part of the narrative. Whereas any kind of coverage you see of quantum computing is always quantum mechanics is really difficult. Nobody fully understands it. So here are these computers that we're building that are based on this thing that nobody really understands. So they're super complicated. You know, that is the hype, right? That is the narrative. So if I didn't dive into, okay, let's actually talk about how they work, then I'd kind of be doing it a disservice. But I didn't want it to only be that, because there are many explainers about it. And again, when you really dive in, you realize that it's, you know, it's sociology at the center of it. It's this battle between like those in business and those in wanting to just research and have these exploratory ideas, and kind of the incentive structures around money. So yeah, which not a lot of people write about when they write about quantum computing. It's more about like Feynman and you know, Schrodinger's cat. But
no, I mean, yeah, it felt like you just pitched it right, that it was like, this is a complex structure, but actually here's a way that you can sort of understand how it's working. And also just that thing of like talking about how encryption works. Again, one of those many things, like, I know that there's something that means that my credit card details are safe, right?
yes.
You know, I can buy things on the internet and somehow it doesn't know. I just never thought about that. That's one of the many things that exists in the world. Good, nice to think about it. And suddenly just to think, oh, right, oh, so that's how it works. Oh, okay.
Do you know, it's funny so that was one of my favorite bits to write, because it let me kind of dive into my maths nerdy stuff. It's all about prime numbers and whatnot. And that was prime number. I read a book about prime numbers when I was quite young. And that was one of the things that kind of inspired me to want to go and study maths. For anyone who's interested in maths, I did pure maths, which is like very kind of dives into things like prime numbers in a really nerdy way. So I've always been like very fascinated by that and always wanting to like make it interesting for people. So I was excited to write that bit. And I remember when I wrote this sample chapter, my agent was like, I think we're going to cut out the maths to send it to the publisher. It's a little bit complicated. I was like, no, this is the whole point of this book. But anyway, she made me like reduce it a little bit just to kind of sell the book. And then when I was writing it, I was like, this is all going back in. I believe in what I'm doing. If it's a little bit too nerdy, people can skip forward one page and they'll be on to the other stuff. But I'm putting this in for the folk that do want to know and do want to have that level of understanding, and for the fellow maths nerds like me that feel the need to have it. But that's again the point, right? It's not about, you don't have to be interested in every part of an industry or the intricacies of, you know, you can have an opinion about whether or not you think the internet is a positive or negative impact on society. Most people have an opinion on that, but the vast majority of people don't have an understanding of like network infrastructure. But that doesn't mean that you can have an opinion around the social impacts of the internet. And it's the same with all these complicated or complex seeming technologies. Is that like, oh, I don't get how a quantum computer works, so I can't possibly have an opinion on like whether or not the government should fund programs on it. It's like, well, you have an opinion on how the government funds like homelessness, and do you have a really deep understanding of like the sociology of the homeless? No, but you have an opinion. So I think it's again coming back to that, like trying to showcase that there are ways of engaging and being part of this world without being a technical expert.
I mean, you're sort of talking about that interest in maths, and the book is sort of essentially it's about asking questions. I wonder if you'd, that even as a child, were you the sort of person that always asked questions or questioned things?
Oh yeah. Okay. I was that annoying kid in class that had their hand up all the time, and I didn't have I think I've got a level of like not really feeling like not being able to read social cues around that. Like I didn't know I was being annoying until I was a little older. Yeah, no, I was always asking questions, always asking why. And I had like I've always wanted to get it. And I think that's why you study maths. Like I think people who study particularly pure maths, it's like you're trying to get to an answer about the universe. You're trying to like understand how things work at their most like pure level. And I maybe part of the reason that I was disappointed with a maths degree is that I realized when you get to that like, you know, higher level of studying it, it doesn't actually give you any answers about the world. It lets you explore things, but it doesn't really tell you like, why is that person not talking to me? Or like, why is it that class dynamics work the way they do? You know, it doesn't give answers for stuff like that. So I don't know. I think there's always been a like yearning for me, and this is something I always have to battle. Even now I'm doing a PhD and I have to battle this like yearning for an answer. But I'm now doing my PhD in the humanities, and as anyone who goes into the social sciences know, the answer is normally it depends, and that's like horrific for someone like me who like wants a unified theory of the universe. So yeah, there's a real impetus for me for understanding, but over the years I've realized that the way to understand things the best way is systems, and thinking about social and technical flows around systems, as opposed to how do I boil this down into Greek letters and write a maths theory on it. So
yeah, that's an interesting sort of human conundrum, isn't it, almost, between wanting, okay, but just tell me what is the answer, tell me what the answer is, and
yes,
the other side of, oh, but well, this could be one answer, but then that's going to affect something in this way.
Yes, and it's part of the reason that things like hype propagate so much, because it plays on that like human yearning for simplicity, or I guess what's the right thing to do. Standing in a supermarket working out whether you should buy oat milk or almond milk or cow's milk, and what's the best for the environment, but what's the best in terms of cost, what's the best in terms of pesticides, what's the best in terms of farmers here in the UK versus farmers in other countries. You want someone to come in and go, oat milk's the best, and even they don't even need to give you a strong argument, they just have to be right, and that's why these headlines, these like strong narrative ideas propagate so much, and why they're tantalizing. But it's the way to see past hype, spoiler alert, is wrestling with conflicting ideas. That's really how you see past hype. It's going, well, what does this depend on? And in what context is this true? In what context is this false? And if it's both true and false, how do I navigate that? Or how do I go about working out the next step? Robots are going to steal your job. Okay, well, what does that depend on? What jobs is it going to steal? In what country? What age of the people? What skill level of the people? Who is it that's making that decision? It's asking these kind of questions that allow you to go, actually, well, yeah, robots are going to steal some jobs, but they're also not going to steal jobs. Well, I mean, it's not them stealing the jobs anyway, and all this sort of thing. So I think, again, that sort of yearning for answers, it's not just about picking what to do morally, it's also about like not wanting to feel bad about getting it wrong, I think. So a lot of it comes back to like a lot of real emotional stuff. It's not just like, tell me how AI works. It's like, how do I go about being a human in the society in which we live in? Which sounds a little bit philosophical, but everything comes back to that at the end of the day when you talk about it for long enough.
And it's our choice, right? And it's what we decide. I mean, I was really thinking about it in the food chapter because I'm a vegan, and there's lots of discussions around that all of the time, and it's sort of becoming a more popular thing now. And but everything, it's not as simple as saying, great, well, that's a good environmental choice, brilliant, because actually it's way more complicated than that. And ultimately what it comes down to is like, okay, we just each make our choices, and also that can change, that can be influenced by something.
Absolutely. And it's I think it's about knowing why you're doing something, right? And again, it's not about going, should I be vegan? I'm going to spend a year doing all the research I possibly can. I'm going to learn how to read all the science papers, and I'm going to go and interview people all around the world. Like, it's not, you can do that if you like. But I think it's about basing it on more than just, oh, my friend said that's the best thing. Or I read this one article that said veganism is the best. Like, do you know what I mean? I think it's about having a level of confidence or personal confidence in your conviction. And veganism is, it's a difficult one, because some people, understandably so, because a lot of evidence suggests it, would say that is the best thing for absolutely everybody to do. I actually got interviewed on a podcast a while ago, and me and the host got into an argument about it, because he was like, veganism is the only way. There's evidence for this, and I was like, there's also evidence to show that that's not right in certain contexts. I've got a friend, Claire Finney, who's a food writer. She's been a vegetarian and I think vegan in latter years, 4 years, since she was a very young kid. And I think it was just this year she decided to start eating meat, because she believes that's what the way she's doing it is better for the environment. She's written a few articles about it. So if you're interested, Google her, Claire Finney. So, again, it's like, it's working out for what are you doing something, and being confident in that, not letting that kind of, someone says, well, why are you doing it? Don't get defensive and say, well, this is the absolute right thing. It's like, well, this is why I'm doing it. I'm not an expert at this, but this is what I believe. And allowing that engagement, allowing that conversation, as opposed to having this sort of absolutist view of the world.
What time is it? We've got a little bit longer left. In the book, you sort of talk about, so it's like now and then, I forgot, is it called now, near, and then future? So,
now, next, nearing. Oh God, I've forgotten. It's like, yeah, the three, what's happening now, what's coming next, and what's sort of further on the horizon.
I wonder, maybe this is a bit of a wild card question to throw you on a Sunday morning, but if somebody said, Gemma, here's loads of money, you can invest in one thing, or you can research one thing for, you know, the future that you think is going to be particularly useful, I wonder what you would pick.
Well, different research as a writer, just being interested would be different in terms of researching, because I think it'll make the world a better place. It probably wouldn't be an area of science and tech, if I'm honest. It would probably be something like, how do we move towards the commons approach to society or something like that. It would probably be closer to looking at political landscapes, or looking at how do we shift away from our capitalist society? How do we see something different? Because at the end of the day, a lot of the issues that are inherent in science and tech aren't, as so many people say, it's not inherent in the technology, the science itself. It's how it's used, and it's the system into which it works, and the impact that it has on the existing world that we're in. And the existing world we're in has particular structures that I would argue are not conducive to equitable, good usage of many different kinds of technologies. So it's not the changing of the technology that's required, it's the systems in which they come into. So something like, for instance, I would love to see the way intellectual property works being different, because that would come if we didn't have such strong I'm talking about Western capitalist societies here, because it's obviously different in other places, but the way that intellectual property works is the problem when it comes to things like pharmaceutical companies and chemical companies, pesticides, so on and so forth. This like ownership of an idea, or ownership of knowledge, it, you know, is what fuels prices being the way they are, and incentives being the way they are, and even laws being the way they are. So for me, you know, looking at these kind of structures, perhaps I think would be interesting in terms of trying to think about, you know, really seeing a different world. Because, you know, it's a bit of imagination as well, right? Like I was reading something the other day, this piece by a guy called Jeff Mulgan, who used to be, and I think he was an advisor in government, and then he ran Nesta, which is like a futures innovation government body, and I think he's been at a think tank, and he's now in academia. But anyway, he's really looked at innovation in many different ways, and he wrote this paper sort of calling for a thing called the exploratory social sciences, which was saying, instead of like analyzing things and looking at the history of stuff, why are we not putting forward more ideas? And he's kind of making an argument the way social science in the academy works is not conducive to that. But I thought it was really interesting. He was talking about like, what does it mean to imagine different really different societies? And there's that whole like adage, is it who is it? Is it I can't remember who it is that said it, but it's, you know, it's more difficult to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of the world, right? It's that kind of Mark Fisher stuff around capitalist realism. It's not just like capitalist stuff, but in general, like it's really difficult to imagine a different society versus the one that we live in. So how do we do that? How do we put forward different ideas? How do we be creative around different economic systems? That is for somebody who doesn't study economics, how on earth do you even begin to start asking those questions, never mind answering them? So for me personally, I think that would be, that is what I'm doing with my PhD right now. That's why I'm in research, is to try and find ways of wrestling with the stuff so that I can put forward ideas as opposed to just analysing, and hoping that by putting those ideas out, you can instigate some form of imagination or change the imaginary that's already there. I don't know. Maybe that's idealist of me.
I sort of feel like at this time in the future of the planet, idealism is really what we need.
Well, or optimism or hope, you know. I've been thinking about hope a lot recently, if you'll indulge me for a second. So I just had a baby. I've got a 7-week-old daughter. She was 7 weeks yesterday. And I don't know, being somebody who writes critically and somebody who is more on the left and politically and all that sort of thing, it's quite easy to criticize and to feel really bad about the future. Also, people who are, care a lot about climate change, we hear a lot about climate anxiety and all these sorts of things. It's quite difficult, I think, to think about the future. When you are pregnant and then have a child, it's like you almost have a responsibility to be hopeful. Like, you can't be pessimistic about the future and at the same time like bring a human into it and be like, sorry, I think the future's terrible, but enjoy. That's like not fair, right? It's a horrific thing to do. So I've been thinking a lot about this like responsibility to hope, and what does that look like for a critic, and what does that look like for people who look into things, and the more you look into things, the more depressed you can get sometimes. So I don't think it's necessarily idealism. I think it's that kind of optimism and that feeling of like, well, we can change things, and I can do something, and I don't have to sit in this pessimism. So that's my way of dealing with it anyway.
I think hope. I read a really interesting essay by the writer Rebecca Tomas, and she was talking about the difference between climate grief and climate depression, and how we talk about climate grief, but actually what we mean is climate depression. And that's when we get to this point where we think we can't do anything. And actually what we do is come from this perspective of grief, where we say, here's the things that we really love, and out of that love we're galvanized to do something.
That's interesting. Grief versus depression. What an interesting way of, that's made me think about lots of things. Yeah I don't know. I think it's you hear that a lot from people who are, I think some areas of the left can be it's a really depressing place to be, but I think this sort of younger, more fiery, more idealistic sometimes stuff, I'd rather be in that, sitting around that table, than everything is awful table. Even though, yes, lots of things are awful. It's not about denying the fact that things are bad. It's just about not getting lost in that. And that's the same when you're thinking about these various areas of science tech. It's very easy to feel like the world is terrible when you look at AI for long enough. But that doesn't do anything, does it, other than make you feel like crap.
And also, like you sort of say in the book, like there's this narrative of robots are coming to steal our jobs, but actually it's the humans, it's us.
Yeah,
we're the ones that are responsible for this technology,
right? And
it's remembering that actually we've got that power, whether that power is being used in the way that we think it should be or not.
Right,
actually.
Right, exactly. And again, that goes back to why I think researching or thinking about different imaginings of how society works versus the actual tech. The tech is getting developed anyway. People will do that. So I don't need to do that. Other folk are doing that. But I feel that there's more work needing done in that. How does that go from the lab to the world?
Oh, Gemma, this is really interesting. I'm going to move on to the Q&A. I'm going to have a look at the questions. If you've got any more, do send them in. Okay, so someone says, as a journalist, do you find it difficult to present fact in an attention-grabbing way without resorting to hype yourself?
Yeah, I do. It was one of the things that, again, was part of my like wrestling with this concept of hype, and that led me to writing the book, was thinking about my responsibility as a writer or a person who has I don't have a huge platform, but has a platform, and people listen to me and take me seriously sometimes. And so, how do I utilize that? How do I feel about it? And does everybody else who has a platform think like this? Obviously, the answer is no. There's people who think about it more than me, and so on and so forth. It's a difficult one because, again, it comes back to the broader system in which it exists. So, we all know the issues with the media ecosystem and the sort of business of media, right? Pithy, separatist, bombastic ideas get more clicks, which makes more money. And so, you're operating again within within a system where hype is required in order to be heard, but you almost have to immediately undercut yourself if you want to put forward some, what's that whole thing around, it's like tabloid in the headline and broadsheet in the content, and I don't know, it's one of the things that perhaps is the reason that I am not a beat journalist, and I don't do as much constant quick writing as I used to. I'm now much more interested in doing deeper, whether it's book projects or research projects, because I struggle with that capturing attention for the purpose of getting a message across. It is, of course, something I've been thinking a lot about over the coronavirus pandemic, because it's like, how do you capture attention to get people to take action, wash their hands, wear a mask, so on and so forth, but also give in deep complicated information, which all of these things also require. And I think part of the problems where people have been, you're having conspiracy versus people being frankly too science is amazing to the rescue, I think that's too much as well, is where it gets muddied without people diving into the how it works at the center, which I would hope you would still at the inclusion of wearing a mask and wash your hands and so on and so forth, but without it just being this diktat. So yeah, it's not something I have an answer to. It's obviously what I explore a lot in the book, but I wish that more, I think a lot of journalists do think about it. I think a lot of journalists feel that their hands are tied by the business in which they exist. And you only have to look at the amount of journalists that have been made redundant in the past couple of years and the rise of freelancing to see that really is part of the problem.
Okay, great. Someone says, as an ex-science teacher, I'm so pleased to hear such enthusiasm for the subject. Do you do talks in schools at all? And if not, please consider it.
Yeah, I do some talks in schools. I've done some primary school stuff. I've done a lot of high school stuff, and then into universities as well. It's another thing that similar to this journalism question. It's like, how do I temper my, I want people to be enthusiastic about science, and any science teacher would say the same, right? You want your students to think science is awesome, which in many ways it is. But there are also a lot of issues within science, within the history of science, within how science works nowadays, particularly in terms of science jobs. And you only have to look at gender split within things like physics and maths. Biology is not quite so bad, but to know that there are a lot of inherent issues. You only have to look at the history of eugenics to know that science is super complicit in atrocities, the nuclear bombs, climate change, the invention of, steam engines and so on and so forth. So I find it an interesting challenge to come into school and be enthusiastic about science, whilst also encouraging critical thinking and encouraging this idea that science is actually, I think, becomes far more interesting when you see this much more nuanced reality of the world, as opposed to isn't it amazing that a volcano does this? Which it is amazing that a volcano does this. So maybe more for high school. Primary, I suppose it is more just about enthusiasm. But yeah, it comes out to what's the role of a science journalist versus the science popularizer versus a science teacher. They all have similar roles, but also so different and very different responsibilities inherent in them. But yay, go science teachers.
Somebody says, do you think we've become lazy at engaging with the debates? Does the human yearning for that definitive answer make most of us settle for the headline and lets us off having to look further?
I think that yes, there is definitely an element of that, and that's part of the argument that I make in the food chapter and also in the cancer chapter, that by not engaging, we're kind of letting the status quo tick along, or listening to these exciting, tech is going to save us ideas. We go, oh, we don't need to worry about it because someone else is dealing with it, and so we don't kind of engage in depth. So yes, there's an element of laziness. However, I don't want to say that everybody's lazy if they don't engage with headlines. We've all got our lives to lead, and we don't have the time or the impetus to go really in depth with absolutely everything we engage with. I think that'd be a pretty miserable existence, frankly. So I don't know. The solution for me is about just not taking things at face value and allowing yourself to not know, for a second, as opposed to reading something and going, I know the answer now, cool, I can move on. Allowing yourself to be like, well, I've read this and that's what this says, but that's limited because it's only one thing, or it's limited because it's coming from this particular political leaning, or it's limited because it's come from this person who lives in this country and they're not going to understand somebody who lives elsewhere. You know, it's understanding the context in which a message comes so that you don't just take it to heart and then move on. And I think it's when people take that extra step of like working out where the context of a message, or just simply going, I've read this and I'm now just going to go, what does that depend on? And even if you only think about it for a couple of seconds, it's not about encouraging doubt. It's about encouraging this feeling of like everything works within a system, and what is the system? Not conspiratorially, just the reality of a complex world. I think that if you do that, it's very difficult to then just sit back and go, oh, well, but it also doesn't mean that you end up in a, you know, going down a rabbit hole and not being able to eat your breakfast because you're too busy like Googling stuff, although it's fine if that happens every now and again, of course. So I don't think it's necessarily about laziness. I think it's about that yearning allows for people to take advantage of that. And so that's where you get these very simplified headlines. You get these people pitching ideas that are absolutist and so on and so forth, because they know that it stops me from going further. So it's both people's fault. It's not just the audience, it's those putting it out, knowing that that's the system in which we exist. So yeah, that was a bit of a rambly answer. I guess I just don't want to say everybody's lazy.
Someone says, oh, this is a big question. I'm looking at doing a degree which makes the world a better place. Do you recommend humanities degree, economics, social policy?
Oh my goodness, that's a great question. You want to do a degree that makes the world a better place. I think that whatever degree you do, I don't think it's about what degree you do. I think it's about the way you approach your own education. So if you do a degree in physics, outside your degree or alongside your degree, are you also reading about the history of physics? Are you also reading about science policy? Are you also reading about the difficulties around gender representation in physics? Are you also reading about that homeless guy that you saw on the way into your lecture, right? So I don't think it's necessary. I don't think one degree or one type of degree is gonna allow you to make the world a better place. I think any degree is going to give you a level of insight into something at a deep level, but what I think makes that richer is then sort of going, well, what's the context in which this degree exists? And, you know, I studied maths and I did not do that when I was doing my maths degree. I just, you know, wrote out my Greek letters and memorized proofs and so on and so forth. And I didn't ever think about where maths came from or the problem. You know, I wanted to get a job and I knew that by having a maths degree, I was going to get a job, but I didn't really think about whether that actually made me good for the job. And is that a fair system? And how does degrees work with class? And I didn't think about that stuff really. And it's not until now, in more recent years, that I've had a much more humanities approach that's made me think differently. That's not to say that I think humanities is the answer. I think it's the combination of both. So whether you do humanities, dive into tech and science and think about how that is related. And if you do science and tech, think about what is the humanities of that. It all exists, both in terms of academic literature, but also just out in the world. Read magazines, go to art exhibitions. You're here at a literary festival, so you're already doing it, right? So that to me is how you make a world a better place. It's having that much more broad approach and try to contextualize what you're doing as much as you can before you go mad.
Okay, I think we've got time for one or two more questions. So someone says, perhaps contrary to popular belief, the UK has managed to remain the 6th largest world manufacturing economy. This is largely thanks to many small and highly innovative businesses. Where do you think the UK is strongest in industry, and where is our educational system weakest?
Oh, big question. Well, okay, I'll start with that last one. Where do I think the educational system is weakest? I think it's weakest in the sense that we silo off subjects, and that I think links back to my previous answer. I think that we try and force students into particular boxes, and there's not as much cross pollination between different areas of knowledge. I also think that the way that the sort of narrative in the UK that science and tech is more valuable as a educational area, and we've seen that with, I mean, even just this last year, defunding arts degrees, for instance, that narrative is, I think, very dangerous, both in terms of making people feel like crap if they don't like science and tech and giving a lot of young people a complex, but also just in the reality of the types of people that we end up with, different kinds of skills. If everybody learns to code, it's not going to be a very valuable career, is it? So what does that mean when we're encouraging people to all do science and tech because they'll get a job? Well, if everybody has science and tech skills, then they're not really going to get a job, are they? And then we're going to have a dearth of people who have different kinds of understanding, different kind of skills. So that to me is where there's gaps in education. It's this, again, not looking at the broader picture and having this idea that science and tech is solely valuable and is the only thing that can move an economy and a country forward. In terms of where I think the UK is strongest, I don't know. I mean, that what you're saying about it being the sixth biggest manufacturer, yes, but the UK also relies a lot on other countries for certain things. Like, okay, for, you know, a perfect example would be if you look at, for instance, how countries and economies shift their numbers around waste for climate targets, right? They'll say, oh, we're not got as much waste anymore, we're recycling more. And then you look into the numbers and you look into what a country's actually doing, and they're shipping their waste to like Indonesia. And then Indonesia's numbers is super high because they've got lots of waste. Why? Because they're taking everybody else's waste, because it works from a trade perspective and a money perspective. So I think we always have to like question these numbers around like the UK being this big manufacturing powerhouse, and it's because it's, you know, it's like, well, what does that depend on, and what is that doing to other countries, and so on and so forth. So where's the UK strongest? I think the UK is strongest in the sense that it has an opportunity to do more. I don't think it does it to a degree. I think that we have a lot of great educational structures here, despite these problems that I was suggesting. I think that we have the opportunity to take more leadership in big global problems. I'm worried about the fact that there's a very nationalistic vibe at the moment with the UK. I don't think that's useful for the UK. But I do think that we obviously have really great, great biotech, for instance. That's one area that we're really good on that. But unfortunately, a lot of that stuff then goes into a system where intellectual property is bought, certain people get very rich, and some people get drugs after 12 years. Great to have the manufacturing or the science skills, but like, what does it really look like on this more global perspective? So that was a super rambly answer again. Sorry about that. You could probably hear my politics coming through loud and clear there, but I do think that we're a little bit too, isn't the UK great on innovation? Like, I think we have to be slightly more critical about those narratives.
Okay, there's one more question and one comment, so I'm going to swiftly get them in there. So the question is, an area where tech is having a lot of impact at the moment is continuous glucose monitors, showing those with type 2 diabetes, how food actually impacts on them. Is this an area you've looked at?
Specifically at glucose monitors? No, I don't. I suppose I don't really look at, unless I've written an article on something, I won't have gone super in depth into any. If I've written an article recently about it, then I would have, but I haven't recently written an article about glucose monitors. Is there a particular, say that question again, is there a particular reason for?
No, it's just saying that that's somewhere where tech is having a lot of impact at the moment. And yeah, asking if it's an area to look at. So they're continuous glucose monitors.
Continuous glucose, but yeah, I mean, it's tech. I think tech has impact in so many different ways. Obviously that's an amazing thing for people with diabetes, and it's also great for, I mean, if you look at broader athletes, for instance, those super sapient things you see that many athletes are wearing and so on and so forth. I'm not sure what to add though, I'm afraid.
And then this comment, and then I'm going to close, is yesterday Gordon Brown talked about hope being central to fixing problems. I'd love to put Gemma and Gordon in a room. I think they'd have a brilliant conversation and produce many ideas.
Well, if you want to set that up, happy to chat. Yeah, I think hope is there, just not blind hope. That would be my little addendum, which I think is also what I'm trying to say in Smoke and Mirrors. Idealism, optimism, and so on and so forth are really powerful forces, along with hope, and that's great. But what we can't have is it at the expense of critique. And one little thing I'll add, the chapter that I have on space commercialization, and a lot that's about people wanting to, Elon Musk's and the Virgin Galactics and all that, wanting to go and explore, and this idea of like space being the final frontier, and this amazing place that we can go and awesome things can happen, and look at the power of science and tech. I sort of wrote a much more critical chapter, because I don't need to add to that, because that narrative is loud and clear. And I do think there's lots of things about space that's awesome. But I wrote a chapter kind of contextualizing a little bit more, talking about the business of space and the issues with those kind of ideas. And I had quite a few people say, wow, you're really negative about space. How can you be negative about space? Space is this amazing thing. That's not hopeful. That's not optimistic. And I would say, well, you're also not adding anything by just being blindly hopeful. That's not useful. And I've argued in the chapter, it lets a lot of things go under the surface, shall we say. You're complicit in bad things happening by only having blind hope. So I would add hope essential, as long as it's not blind hope.
It's a very good point to end on. Gemma, thanks for taking the time this morning to chat. It was really brilliant.
No worries. And yeah, obviously, if you're interested in any of the ideas that come up, please do grab a wee copy of the book. I didn't want to explain the whole book in the hope that people wouldn't would go and read it as opposed to just listening in. But there's a lot of the themes that we've touched on that obviously go into a lot more detail and give you a bit more about each of these areas. So go to an independent bookstore though, or buy it through the festival.
Yes, in Berwick, I've got the book here. You can buy it in Greaves, but if you're not a Berwick, you can buy it, from any good bookshop, ideally independent. Thank you everyone for joining us today. If you've enjoyed it, you can tag us on social media. We're at Berwick Lit Fest across the platforms. We are a charity, and any donations to the festival are warmly welcomed. They will help us with next year's festival. There's a link in the chat, or you can have a look on our website. And there's a few more events today. So today's our last day. So if you have a look on our website, you'll see the whole programme there. We hope to see you at some more events. Gemma, thank you for talking.
Thank you, Chloe. Really appreciate your questions and everything. It's been much appreciated. Right. Thanks everybody for coming in and asking questions too.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.